A lone Drath warship fired a warning shot into a human scout craft, attempting to break their resolve. The energy blast tore through the small ship's rear plating, leaving a trail of white-hot slag in the dark. 500 years ago, they gave us grain. Today, we brought 250 warships to make sure no one else had to beg. The high orbit of the Vori homeworld smelled of cold copper and the sharp, mineral bite of ion-filtered atmosphere. Inside the central archive spire, Elder Sova stood at the glass. His upper hands pressed against the transparent frame, while his two lower hands moved in small, synchronized rhythmic circles against his dark robes. It was a nervous habit he could not quiet. 17 black Drath battleships held their positions below the clouds, their hulls casting massive, jagged shadows across the northern farming sectors. The local trade networks were dead. The outer observation outposts had stopped sending telemetry 6 hours ago. The Drath Collective had given the scholars a choice: hand over the global data charts within 30 days or watch the library spires burn. Today was the 29th morning. "Elder," a voice called out from the communications pit. Archivist Diorau ran up the steps, her three-fingered hands shaking as she held a heavy data slate. She was 62, her hide graying at the joints, and her respiratory vents clicked with rapid, uneven breaths. "A signal," Diorau said. Her voice broke the silence of the chamber. "It crossed the outer sensor band a minute ago. The encryption format is ancient. Our systems had to pull a translation matrix from the old exploration files." Sova did not turn away from the window. "A merchant vessel. The regional sectors told us they would not send help." "Not a merchant," Diorau whispered, tapping the slate to transfer the audio. "And they are not from the regional sectors." The static that filled the room was thick, layered with the deep hum of a heavy sublight reactor. Then a man spoke. His voice was a low, level baritone that seemed to drag the room into absolute stillness. "This is Captain Ren Holt of the vessel Steadfast Regard," the voice said. "We are crossing the boundary line now. To the Drath fleet holding orbit, you are moving into a restricted zone. Power down your targeting grids and prepare to yield." Sova's lower hand stopped moving. The phrasing was wrong. A lone vessel was running directly toward a blockade that had broken 3 planetary systems. "I wish I could tell you the danger ended with that single voice. It didn't. Stay close." The transmission cut out, leaving only the steady thrum of the spire's internal ventilation. Sova turned from the glass, his eyes tracking the red markers on the primary tactical projection. The lone human ship was moving intentionally slow. It did not weave. It did not activate an evasion screen. It simply drifted toward the line of 17 battleships like a stone falling through water. "How long until they reach the inner picket line?" Sova asked. 12 minutes, Diorau said. She wiped a layer of moisture from her brow. "The Drath flagship has already acknowledged the contact. They are sending a standard automated destruction warning." Sova looked back toward the stars. 5 centuries ago, a Vori cargo transport named the Oruvale had dropped into a dying solar system. The crew had found a primitive colony of hairless bipeds starving in makeshift plastic domes after their main transport engine failed. The Vori pilot had not checked the galactic trade laws. She had not asked for payment. She had simply unloaded every grain container in her hold, filled her water tanks with ice from the local rings, and left before the colonists could even learn her name. The only record of that day lived in a single yellowed page of an old ship's log, preserved in the deepest tier of the spire. "The humans have no military presence in this arm," Sova said, more to himself than to the archivist. "Their central worlds are months away past the core borders. Why would one ship come here to die?" "They aren't alone," Diorau said. On the display deck, the deep-range sensor band did not just flash. It fractured. 4 points of light appeared near the system's 3rd moon, then 8, then 40. The space around the outer rim seemed to peel back as heavy transit fields collapsed all at once. Sova leaned closer to the projection. The incoming hulls did not share a single military silhouette. There were massive, blocky asteroid-cutting platforms with their plasma arrays exposed. There were long, rusted family freighters with hand-painted surface lettering across their bows. Woven between them were gray, slab-sided missile frigates carrying the markings of distant planetary militias. They came from 9 separate approach vectors, moving without a fleet formation or a flagship. It was an unstructured, leaderless wall of iron. On the display, the hull of an old civilian hauler zoomed into view. Across its main cargo bay, someone had welded heavy steel plating to cover a structural leak. Above the weld, written in bold white grease paint that caught the distant star's light, were 2 words: "We remember." "The Drath are shifting their orientation," Diarra reported. Her voice rose an octave. "Commander Bale is ordering the picket lines to form a defensive wall. They are trying to find the command frequency." Inside the Drath flagship, the tactical boards were resetting every 3 seconds. Commander Bale stood behind the primary scanning console, his rigid posture stiffening as the number of contacts climbed past 100. His obsidian-scaled carapace caught the red glare of the warning lights, and his 4 sensory mandibles remained perfectly rigid. "They are not broadcasting a tactical network," Bale said, addressing the command platform where Admiral Yorn sat. "Every ship is running its own independent tracking. There is no flagship to target." Admiral Yorn did not move his upper torso. His gray command mantle showed the insignia of 11 successful blockades. Every one of those victories had followed the strict rules of top-down doctrine. You locate the enemy commander, you break their communications, and you negotiate the terms of withdrawal with the survivor. "Identify the leader," Yorn said. His voice was like grinding stones. "They cannot coordinate a multi-vector drop without a central command node." "There is no node," Bale replied, his mandibles finally twitching as another cluster of signals emerged near the inner ring. "We have tried 3 different electronic warfare suites. There is no encryption to break because they are using open civilian channels. They are simply following the first ship." The steadfast Regard had reached the outer edge of the Drath picket line. It sat there, its forward shields down, its weapon ports closed. Captain Ren Holt cleared his throat before opening the wideband channel again. On the archive spire, Sova listened as the human captain spoke directly to the Drath admiral. "We have an old ledger on our desk, Admiral," Holt said. His baritone was completely steady, lacking any of the formal military cadence the Drath expected. "It says 500 years ago, this world kept our grandfathers alive when they had nothing left to eat. We have a 500-year-old debt and 240 ships behind us. I'll let you decide which one matters more right now." Sova felt the breath leave his throat. He looked down at his lower hands, which had started their small circles again. The math of the galaxy had always been simple. The strong took from the weak, and the scholars recorded what was lost. But the humans were not using galactic math. They had carried a single act of mercy across 5 centuries of dark space, scaling it until it had teeth. "Admiral Yorn is broadcasting an ultimatum," Diarra said, her fingers flying across the archivist console. "He is giving the human fleet 1 hour to clear the orbital lanes. If they remain, he will activate the orbital defense grids we surrendered last week." "And the humans?" Sova asked. Diarra looked up from the screen, her eyes wide under her heavy brow. "They aren't moving. They are turning their engines off." Across the black vacuum, 250 human vessels went dark. Their main sublight engines died in sequence, leaving only the tiny, blue sparks of their attitude thrusters to hold their positions against the solar wind. They sat like an iron reef just beyond the Drath firing line. No declarations followed, no demands were made, no conditions were offered. In the archive spire, Sova watched the tactical map flatten into a terrifying grid of absolute immobility. The silence from the human fleet was heavier than any threat. By turning off their propulsion, they had removed the possibility of a tactical retreat. They were not maneuvering for a better angle, they were simply staying where they stood. "The Drath flagship is signaling the fleet," Diarra said, her hand pointing to a flashing amber node on her terminal. "Admiral Yorn is moving his heavy line forward. They are entering secondary weapons range." Sova did not answer. He was looking at a specific point on the long-range sensor scan. A single human mining platform, its broad hull pitted by decades of rock impacts, had drifted within 1,000 kilometers of a Drath interceptor. On the mining ship's superstructure, a massive mechanical crane, built for breaking iron-rich asteroids, slowly turned its primary cutting beam toward the alien warship's shield generators. It was an industrial tool, clumsy and slow, but the power required to split a mountain was now focused on a single sheet of defensive energy. Inside the Drath command room, Commander Bale tapped his console with increasing force. "The human vessels are maintaining independent targeting loops. They are not locking onto our flagship. They are locking onto the closest hull in front of them." "A civilian tactic," Admiral Yorn said, his obsidian carapace reflecting the cold blue light of the status displays. "They are trying to split our focus. Maintain the vertical formation. Prepare the primary energy arrays for a coordinated strike on their center." "Sir," Bale interrupted, his four mandibles tightening against his face. "If we fire on the center, the outer vessels have enough kinetic mass to ram our flank before the main arrays can recycle. They have no deceleration reserves. If they ignite their emergency burns, they will hit us." Yorn remained perfectly still. The logic of his training demanded an adversary that cared about survival margins. A fleet that parked itself in the path of a siege train without a rear exit was an error in the manual. "They are bluffing," the Admiral muttered, his lower hands gripping the edge of the command mantle. "Issue the 30-minute warning. Direct it to the steadfast regard." The message flashed across the wideband channels, its text repeating in the sharp, blocky characters of the collective's legal code. On the Vori world below, the warning tone echoed through the library corridors, waking the junior scribes who had spent the night carrying historical records into the subterranean stone vaults. Among those archives, a young clerk named Jaren was holding a preservation tray containing the original log of the cargo pilot Oruvale. The page was tiny, made of cheap cellulose that had turned the color of dry sand. He looked up at the ceiling as the distant thunder of the orbital grid testing its capacitors rattled the glass light tubes overhead. He did not drop the tray. He simply sat on the cold stone floor, took a deep breath, and held the ancient paper tighter against his chest. Up in the spire, Sova picked up the wideband receiver. The human response did not come from Captain Ren Holt this time. A different voice broke through the static. A woman, her accent thick with the flat vowels of the Outer Rim colonies. "This is the freighter Clara Jean," she said. The sound of a crying child drifted through the background of her transmission before a door clicked shut, muffling the noise. "To the black ship with the gray flag. My great-grandmother was 6 years old when your world's pilot pulled her out of the mud at the colony site. She died when I was small, but she told me what the grain tasted like. We brought 800 tons of refined fuel in our lower hold. If you start shooting, we are dropping our dampening fields and riding the blast straight into your primary hangar." The channel went dead before the Drath Tech officers could trace the source. "They are crazy," Diarra whispered, her fingers resting on the translation keys. "They brought their families." Sova felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He zoomed the optical sensors onto the Clara Jean. It was a miserable, boxy thing, its hull patched with mismatched plating from 3 different manufacturing yards. It was not a weapon. It was an extension of a living room that had traveled across the stars because an old woman had remembered the taste of bread. The large-scale math of the Drath Empire was beginning to fray against the weight of individual names. Admiral Yorn is changing the sequence, Diarra announced suddenly. Her lower hands clutched her robe so hard the fabric strained. He isn't waiting for the 30 minutes to expire. He is ordering the inner picket line to clear the path by force. On the tactical display, a solitary Drath scout vessel, a sleek, black needle designed for high-speed atmospheric suppression, separated from the main blockade. Its forward lance began to glow with a pale, violet light as it surged toward the human scout craft it had damaged earlier. "They are going to fire again," Sova said, his upper hands tightening against the window frame. The needle ship closed the distance in 3 seconds, its targeting computer calculating the exact trajectory to slice through the human craft's remaining structural supports. The high orbit of the Vori world became a theater of absolute, freezing tension as the violet tip of the weapon reached full charge. But the human fleet did not break. They did not fire a single defensive missile. Instead, 3 separate cargo haulers shifted their attitude thrusters simultaneously, drifting their massive, unprotected flanks directly into the line of sight, shielding the damaged scout with their own bodies. The Drath weapon did not discharge. The Black Needle ship veered sharply to the left, its automated safety overrides forcing a turn to avoid a collision that would have torn its own thin hull apart. Sova leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the red lines of the tactical grid. The open loop was widening. The humans had not just brought ships, they had brought an absolute refusal to let anyone die alone. "Elder," Diarra said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "The Drath flagship is raising its primary shields. They are no longer checking for a command node. They are preparing a full-fleet broadside." The main power lines of the 17 battleships flared all at once, visible from the ground as a line of artificial stars igniting in the morning sky. The hour was gone. The standoff had reached its edge, and the first ship, the Steadfast Regard, was sitting directly in the center of the target lock. A high-frequency alert tore through the Spire's communication boards, its tone different from the standard Drath military pings. It was a countdown timer, initiated from the main power core of the Drath flagship. The digits did not flash on the screen, they simply dropped, second by second, toward 0. The time for talk was gone. "The targeting lock has hardened," Diarra reported, her middle hands clenching the edge of her seat until her gray skin turned pale. "They are not trying to negotiate. The flagship has synchronized the main plasma banks across all 17 hulls. They are going to clear the sector with one volley." Sova did not move from the high window. The air in the archive chamber felt thin, vibrating with the silent, massive accumulation of power in the sky above. On the display, the Steadfast Regard sat motionless, its small hull completely enveloped by the primary red targeting rings of the Drath line. A single human ship against a line of battle was not an engagement, it was a deletion. Inside the human vessel, Captain Ren Holt looked at the primary display board. The red warning light painted his gray-streaked hair and the deep lines around his eyes in a harsh, crimson glare. He did not call for the shields to be raised. He did not reach for the primary throttle. Instead, he reached into his uniform pocket, pulled out an old silver timepiece, a mechanical thing that wound with a small click, and set it on the console beside his logbook. It was an ordinary action, slow and deliberate, completely disconnected from the destruction mounting outside his view screen. The small ticking of the watch was the only sound in his quiet cabin. Then he keyed the fleet-wide frequency. "All captains," Holt said, his baritone voice perfectly level as it carried across 250 civilian and military hulls. "The Drath line has initialized their firing sequence. Do not engage your propulsion. Do not scatter. If they open the path, we close it together." The response from the horizontal fleet was instantaneous, but it did not involve words. On Sova's tactical monitor, the data columns began to shift. The human ships were not trying to escape the synchronized broadside. They were moving closer to each other, closing the physical gaps between their hulls until they formed a solid, continuous wall of iron and steel. The asteroid haulers placed their thick, ore-reinforced noses in front of the thin-skinned medical transports. The militia frigates drifted their missile decks directly behind the heavy fuel carriers, using the civilian ships as physical armor while keeping their own weapon tubes clear. "They are locking themselves into a single mass," Diora whispered, her eyes tracking the defensive density numbers. "If the Drath fire, the explosion will chain through their entire formation. None of them will survive." "That is why they are doing it," Sova said. His lower hands had stopped their nervous circles. They hung limp at his sides. "They are removing the option of a partial victory. The Drath must destroy all of them or none of them." The standoff had escalated past the safety of a single world or a single fleet. The humans had turned the orbit of the Vori homeworld into a civilizational choice. In the Drath Command Center, Commander Bale's mandibles were twitching violently. The numbers on his scanning grid had stopped updating because the human vessels were too close together to be tracked as individual targets. The board showed only one massive, irregular entity with a total mass that exceeded the combined weight of his own battleships. "The tactical network is failing," Bale said, his voice dropping as he turned toward the command platform. "The automation systems cannot distribute the target locks. The computer thinks we are firing on a single moon." Admiral Yorn did not lean forward. His obsidian carapace remained rigid, but his upper hands had tightened around the grip of his gray command mantle until the metallic embroidery began to fray. His entire career had been built on the predictable reactions of smaller cultures. When you threatened them with total destruction, they broke their formations. They ran for the jump points. They turned on each other to secure a conditional surrender. But these creatures were not running. They were leaning into the hit. "The countdown is at 30 seconds, Bale reported. His lower hands hovered over the main firing override. "Sir, if we discharge the main banks into that mass, the debris field will drop into the low orbital lanes within 40 minutes. It will drag our own picket ships down with it." Yorn did not give the order to cancel. To back down now was to admit that a collection of civilian freighters and mining trucks could break a blockade authorized by the High Collective. It would mean the rules of vertical authority were useless against a group of people who simply refused to leave each other behind. "Maintain the sequence," Yorn ordered. His voice was a harsh, scraping sound. "Let them feel the weight of their choice." Then, a new sensor marker ignited on the lowest tier of the archive display. It did not drop out of deep space transit. It did not cross the outer boundary line. It was an old communications relay, an unmapped piece of Vori infrastructure that had sat silent on the surface of the system's dead inner moon for 300 years. The relay was broadcasting an encrypted data stream directly into the Drath flagship's primary command channel. It was not an audio signal, and it carried no human encryption. It was a continuous, high-volume download of ancient Drath military logs, files that had been deleted from the collective's central archives 4 centuries ago during the Great Unification. Sova turned sharply from the window, his upper hands reaching for his terminal as the ancient data began to echo through the spire's receivers. "What is that?" Diora asked, her fingers flying across the conversion keys. "The format. It belongs to the old Drath Third Dynasty." "It's the log of the blockade at the Kalen Rim," Sova said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent whisper as he read the translation columns. "The battle where Admiral Yorn's ancestors supposedly destroyed an enemy fleet without losing a single ship." The data scrolling across the screen showed a different truth. The logs contained the raw telemetry from that ancient conflict, a record of a desperate, hidden retreat where 3 Drath flagships had abandoned their auxiliary units to cover their own withdrawal. The names of the left-behind crews were listed in individual columns, one by one, signed at the bottom by the commander of the line. The signature belonged to the House of Yorn. The countdown timer on the Drath flagship did not hit 0. At exactly 4 seconds remaining, the digits froze, turning from red to a cold, flashing amber. The wideband channel on the Drath flagship did not carry a declaration from a military command. It carried the automated data exchange of an archive system that had found its missing match. 5 centuries ago, when the cargo pilot Oruvale had unloaded her grain hold for the starving human colony, she had used an old transit beacon to coordinate the drop. That beacon had copied her ship's baseline storage data into the planet's crust, including a hidden, unindexed collection of historical logs her people had collected from regional wrecks. The humans had not hacked the Drath network. They had simply plugged the old logbook back into the sky, and the Vori moon relay had broadcasted the file because it was programmed to return what was borrowed. "The transmission is feeding into the entire picket line," Commander Bale said, his hand freezing over the primary fire control. He did not look at the Admiral. His mandibles were locked in a shape that meant absolute public shame. "The lower decks are receiving the logs. The crewmen are reading the casualty lists from the Kalen Rim." The vertical chain of command inside the Drath fleet did not break from an exterior strike. It dissolved from within. The 17 battleships were no longer waiting for an order to conquer. They were looking at a document that proved their leader's house had built its legacy on a lie. Admiral Yorn stood on the command platform, his upper hand still gripping his mantle. The metallic fabric tore completely under his fingers, leaving a loose thread to dangle against his obsidian carapace. He looked at the tactical display where the human fleet remained packed together like an unyielding wall of stone. He could fire and erase them, but if he fired now, the logs would survive in the planet's crust forever, and his fleet would return to the collective as executioners who had killed to hide a coward's name. "Cancel the sequence," Yorn whispered. His voice was barely a rattle in his throat. "Power down the primary banks. Turn the line." On the archive spire's monitor, the amber lights shifted. The 17 black battleships did not sprint for the jump points. They peeled away from the low orbital lane slowly, their heavy thrusters firing in defensive clusters as they turned their backs to the world they had besieged. They moved past the outer sensor band one by one, disappearing into the dark transit lanes without a single parting shot. The silence that followed their departure was different from the held breath of the morning. It was the quiet of a field after the storm had missed. 2 hours later, a single human shuttle separated from the steadfast regard and dropped through the atmosphere. It did not land at the military docks or the executive plaza. It touched down on the pale, damp grass outside the eastern entrance of the central archive spire. Elder Sova walked down the stone steps alone, his lower hands tucked into his sleeves to hide their trembling. The air outside smelled of wet earth and the clean, sweet scent of growing grain from the nearby valley. The shuttle's bay door clicked open, and Captain Ren Holt stepped onto the grass. He was smaller than Sova had expected from his voice, his shoulders slightly bent under a plain blue service coat that had frayed at the cuffs. He carried no weapon, no formal treaty documents, and no flag. In his right hand, he held a small, square case made of scratched clear plastic. Inside the case lay a single sheet of yellowed sand-colored paper. "Captain," Sova said, his voice level but low as he stopped 3 paces away, "your fleet is remaining in orbit." "They are checking their seals and taking on water from the rings," Holt said, his baritone rough from the hours of open-channel talk. "Then they are heading back to the rim. There is a harvest coming up in the Orion Arm." Sova looked at the plastic case. "You risked a civilizational war for a record that our own High Council had forgotten. We have no medal to give you. We have no warships to offer your colonies." "We didn't come for metal," Holt said. He reached out and placed the plastic case into Sova's upper hands. The paper inside was thin, covered in the dark, angular script of the old Vori cargo pilot Oruvale. At the very bottom of the margin, written in the fading blue ink of a human exploration commander 5 centuries dead, was a short column of numbers and a single line of English prose. "Received 12,000 tons of seed. Paid, we remember." "Keep it with Oro's record," Holt said, his fingers resting for a second on the edge of the plastic sleeve before he let go. "Let them sit together. If someone else comes to your door looking for a piece of bread, write it down so the person you help knows what was given. Pass it forward." The human captain turned back toward his shuttle without waiting for a formal reply or an archivist's signature. His boots left 2 clear tracks in the morning dew as he walked across the pale grass. In the deepest tier of the spire, the young clerk Jaron set the preservation tray down onto the stone table. The ancient cellulose did not rattle against the frame. He turned the climate lock, and the seal engaged with a soft, clean hiss that excluded the outer world. The paper lay flat under the glass. The words faced up, counted.